The two most important takeaways from the intro that I found were one, the part where the intro basically says that McCarthy was someone who made baseless claims. This part says that McCarthy was a master at making outlandish charges about domestic subversion and getting away with it. When I read this, it immediately made me think that McCarthy was someone who was passionate about things he believed in, but he also made claims that were baseless. It didn't have much evidence to them. The second most important takeaway from the intro that I found was that people who went against McCarthy found themselves the subject of vicious attacks and smear campaigns. This made me think that McCarthy was someone who was very passionate, almost aggressive, and it could have been McCarthy himself, or I also thought that it could be some of McCarthy's supporters. They must have attacked people who disagreed with McCarthy, and they just must have been a very passionate group. The specific example that the intro provides says that Miller Tidings was a member of the Senate subcommittee, and he argued against McCarthy's claims and called him a fraud and a hoax. And McCarthy ended up undermining his reelection campaign. It doesn't necessarily say how, but McCarthy undermined his reelection campaign, and that made Tidings struggle getting elected, struggle with his job, his position. And that just makes me think that McCarthy, again, he must have been someone who was very influential, because it without a strong group of supporters, it's hard to do something like undermine someone's entire election campaign. So this intro honestly just made me think that McCarthy was someone who was passionate, influential, maybe had a big group of supporters, and he must have been a very good persuader, because he was able to make claims without evidence, and he was able to get away with these claims. And he also, his himself or his supporters were to attack people who disagreed with them. The first question is, what is the main argument or opinion that McCarthy presented in his speech? The main argument that McCarthy is presenting is that the American people are struggling after the war. This is not a period of peace. This is a time for the Cold War. People are struggling, and he believes that this is because that there are people within the American government who are traitors, and he believes that these people are communists. They are selling the nation out. They are basically just not having the benefits of America or the American people in mind, because they have an agenda that is focused elsewhere, whether that be with communism and like imposing communism on the country, or focusing more on foreign relations, or a quote unquote enemy of the American people. These are the people who are in the State Department, who are in positions of power within the American government, and they are, I can't remember what the word is off the top of my head, but like domestic traitors. The intro says domestic subversion, but yeah, basically a domestic traitor, someone who was within the nation who was working against it. Question 2, what types of evidence does McCarthy present to support his claim? I kind of touched on this when I answered the first question. He believes that there are people within the State Department or the American government who are members of the Communist Party. He specifically says that he has a case of 205 individuals who are card carrying members, which are people who are active or involved with a certain group or a certain party. Specifically, he's talking about the Communist Party. He doesn't provide much evidence. Most of his claims are pretty baseless. The only piece of evidence that he has was his list of 200 people who are loyal to the Communist Party, which the intro also says that he never actually identified anyone, which makes me think that he made this up to prove his point. So he didn't have any solid pieces of evidence to support his claim. Question 3. If you had to describe the style or type of argument that McCarthy is making, how would you describe it? I would describe McCarthy's argument as one that focuses largely on pathos. He focuses on, honestly, almost like a fear mongering tactic, and he appeals to the listeners' values, their emotions, and I want to say their religion. I want to talk about this because I thought that it was interesting. One of the first things that he says was that the American people are in a battle between atheism and Christianity. And again, at the end of his speech, he also references 30 pieces of silver. This, I did a little bit of background research. This is a biblical reference to when I believe Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And this reference is supposed to symbolize dishonesty, disloyalty, people, doing harmful things to each other for their own personal gain. And I actually did a little bit of background research on religion during this time period, during the 1950s, and I found this source that kind of talks about how most people in the 1950s were religious. 57% of the US population went to church. And this source talks about how a lot of people were Christians or Catholics. And I think that McCarthy was trying to appeal to people's religion, their values, their emotions, to persuade them into accepting his argument. He's trying to say that, hey, we are Christians. We have these morals and these beliefs. And there are people in our government who are communists and they're atheists and they're against you and they're against your beliefs. And this attempt to kind of divide people and say, here's us Christians and here are these other people. They're atheists, they're communists, they're bad, they're against us. It creates division and it makes people more persuaded to believe in McCarthy's argument because they probably don't agree with atheists, then they don't agree with communists because they assume these communists to be atheists, and that kind of creates this divide. Question 4, why do you think some citizens were persuaded by McCarthy's argument? I kind of talked about this in question 3 when I talked about McCarthy tapping into the listeners' religious beliefs, but I also think that another reason why some people were persuaded was because he seemed to have America at like the forefront of his argument. He was saying that America was the strongest nation on earth. We were the most powerful intellectually and morally. We were a beacon of honor in a place of destruction. This whole part in the beginning, he starts his argument by saying, we are America. He has this nationalism. We are America. We're great. We're beacons of hope. And this pride that people feel about their country makes them more prone to want to protect it. So when McCarthy tries to argue that there are people within the government that are against America, it makes people on edge. It makes them angry. It makes them fearful. And I think that was also one of the reasons why people were persuaded by McCarthy's argument.